Frank Sullivan woke up at 6:30 in the morning, as he had for more than 3 decades. The sound of coffee brewing, the sizzle of butter in a frying pan, and the muffled sound of the news on the radio were part of the routine that kept him going, even on days when his body was complaining. At 61, he knew every corner of the shop where he had worked for 30 years. Not only because he had spent most of his life there, but because he treated it as an extension of himself. It was more than a job. It was where he had taught young apprentices, fixed engines with his own calloused hands, and listened to the complaints of customers who came back more for the respect than the service. So when Greg, the new owner with the starched suit and practiced smile, called him into the office and said that it didn't make sense to keep someone doing the old ways anymore, Frank felt something snap inside. He didn't argue. He just took off his overalls, folded them carefully, and walked out with his eyes fixed on the ground, trying to understand how, suddenly, everything he had built could no longer be worth anything. The following days were a series of closed doors. Frank would clock in at employment agencies, smaller mechanic shops, dealerships, anywhere that smelled of oil and metal. But the answer was always the same, with variations in tone. We're looking for a more dynamic profile. We need someone with up-to-date experience. Have you ever thought about retiring? Each no seemed to push him further into a kind of social invisibility. Even the acquaintances who greeted him with a "Hey, Master Frank," would look at him with a mixture of pity and distance. Sometimes he would sit on a park bench and watch the cars go by, wondering where he had gone wrong. He didn't want to go back in time or regain his status. He just wanted to feel like he still had a place in the world, that his experience still had some value. It was on one of those days that, while taking a shortcut down a quiet side street, he spotted Mr. Harris's old garage, which had been closed for years. It was abandoned, with broken windows and weeds growing through the cracks in the sidewalk. But in Frank's eyes, this was more than a crumbling building. It was a possibility. Frank spent the next few days returning to that garage, as if visiting an old friend in a coma. Every time he stopped there, he noticed something different. A crooked shelf that was still standing, a rusty tool forgotten in the corner, the mark of the old sign that was no longer there. Everything was in ruins, but there was still structure, there was still a foundation. With a wrench in his hand and a flashlight in his coat pockets, he began to clean it little by little, without promises or clear plans. He just needed to move, use his hands, feel like he was doing something other than just waiting for another rejection. It was during this silent process that he thought of Tom, an old acquaintance from the golden age of the garages, a renowned mechanic who had already retired, but whose ethics and loyalty made him the only person Frank truly trusted. Tom didn't hesitate when Frank explained the idea, even though it was still full of holes. He showed up at the garage one cold morning with a toolbox in his hands and a tired but sincere smile. From that day on, the two of them began an improvised routine. They cleaned up rubble, replaced roof tiles, welded structures, and laughed about old stories between one hammering and the next. There was no money, no clientele, and no guarantee that it would work. But there was something there that kept them going, perhaps the desire to show that they were still useful, or simply the pleasure of building something with their own hands, without rushing and without anyone over them telling them to cut costs or push unnecessary work. Little by little, the garage stopped being just an old place. It gained an identity, it gained a soul. Over time, some residents began to notice the movement in the old garage. First, there were the curious. Retirees who walked slowly by with their dogs, teenagers riding wheelies, neighbors who remembered when Harris used to fix trucks there. Then came the first customers, somewhat suspicious, more because of the memories of the two than because of the facade of the place, which didn't even have a sign yet. An old man with the hood of his car tied up with wire, a mother desperate because her car brakes were cracking before taking her son to school. Frank and Tom served everyone calmly, explained the problem clearly, charged a fair price, and refused service when it wasn't necessary. Trust began to grow there, in the eye to eye, in the sincere handshake, in the simple words that didn't promise miracles, only honesty. Meanwhile, Greg, the same man who had fired Frank without thinking twice, was increasingly bothered by the rumors that the two old men from the old garage were gaining customers. To him, it was impossible that a structure without a new coat of paint, online ads and sales consultants was attracting so many people. Driven by vanity and irritation, he tried to undermine the competition. First, he spread the word that Frank's services were unsafe. Then, he sent a city inspector to allege irregularities at the location to no avail. But the community was already starting to notice what was happening. Long-time customers of Greg's garage, dissatisfied with inflated quotes and unnecessary parts replacements, were starting to silently leave. Frank didn't advertise or post before and after photos. He just did what he always knew how to do: work properly. It was on a muggy Friday afternoon that things really got ugly. Frank arrived early as usual, but found the garage door broken in, tools strewn across the floor, and the tires of two cars that were being repaired completely flat. Tom showed up soon after, and even though he tried to remain calm, he couldn't hide his anger. This wasn't just vandalism, it was a warning. Neither of them said Greg's name directly, but it was hard not to connect the dots. Instead of calling the police, they decided to clean up, reinforce the lock and keep going. The next day, they set up a simple camera in the corner of the roof and continued working as if nothing had happened. The feeling was one of vulnerability, but also of stubbornness. It was as if, at that point, giving up would be handing it over to those who had always counted on the fatigue of others. The sabotage, however, did not go unnoticed by the neighborhood. On Saturday morning, a line of cars formed across the street before the garage even opened. People who had never set foot there before showed up to offer their help. A young man with experience in electrical work installed floodlights at the entrance. A woman brought cake and coffee for the mechanics. A group of young people cleaned the facade and painted the front door with the name Sullivan and Tomas Garage. It was as if the city, silent for so long in the face of injustice, had woken up. What had begun as a personal new beginning was turning into something bigger, a small community revolution against the logic of exploitation, appearances, and profit at any cost. Frank watched it all with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly seen. Little by little, the garage became a meeting place, not only for customers, but for people who wanted to talk, offer help, or simply be in a place where they felt welcome. Frank and Tom didn't change the way they worked at all. They continued to sweat under cars, share old tools, and wipe off grease with old rags. But now, around them, there was something that couldn't be bought: respect. People came from distant neighborhoods, recommended by word of mouth, by relatives or acquaintances who said, "Go there, they're different," and they really were. In times of rush, impersonal service, and greed disguised as efficiency, that garage offered something rare: attention. Frank didn't consider himself a hero. He still woke up early, had back pain, washed his hands with soap until late. But now he came home with something he hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. Greg, on the other hand, was beginning to feel the effects of his own poison. His garage, which had been full, now had too many vacancies and too few customers. He started offering promotions, lowering prices, and creating social media campaigns, but it was no use. His reputation as an opportunist had already stuck like old oil to an engine, hard to remove, impossible to ignore. One day, he showed up in person at Frank's garage, trying to feign cordiality, offering a partnership proposal. Frank listened in silence, leaning on the workbench, while Tom just crossed his arms at the back of the shed. In the end, Frank said that he didn't make deals with people who tried to bring others down in order to get ahead. Greg left without looking back and never came back. The garage didn't celebrate loudly, but everyone felt that that moment was a kind of final point, a necessary closing of a cycle. Over time, the garage was no longer known by the name painted on the door. People began to refer to it as Frank's Garage. It was an unofficial title, but it was loaded with meaning. It represented not only recognition of a job well done, but also a kind of collective redemption. It was as if, by valuing that place, the city was correcting an injustice committed not only against Frank, but against all those who had once been discarded for seeming too old, too slow, or out of date. The garage became a symbol that experience still matters, that character cannot be retired, and that dignity cannot be measured by a resume. Frank didn't seek this. He never sought to be a symbol of anything, but he accepted it with humility. After all, each car repaired, each satisfied customer, and each day spent, there was proof that he still had a lot to offer. One Sunday afternoon, sitting in the driveway with a cup of coffee in his hand, Frank looked at the cars parked on the street and the faces that came and went as if this space had always been theirs. Tom dozed in a folding chair nearby, a newspaper draped over his chest. Frank thought about the day he was fired, in that cold office that smelled of new paint and empty promises. He thought about how the pain of feeling discarded had almost paralyzed him, almost made him give up. But there, with grease on his nails and the roar of engines in the background, he felt that life had given him back something that money couldn't buy, the chance to be useful, to be needed, to be remembered not for titles or positions, but for who he really was. And that for him was enough. Months later, the garage received an unexpected invitation. A technical school in the city wanted Frank and Tom to give a talk to the mechanics students. Frank was hesitant at first. He didn't see himself as a speaker, much less as a role model. But he went. He sat in front of a room full of young people wearing caps, baggy t-shirts, and restless looks. He didn't bring slides or a prepared speech. He told how he started, how he learned from his mistakes, how he lost his job, how he rebuilt his life with his own hands. He spoke about ethics, patience, and the importance of respecting each customer as if they were unique. When he finished, the silence in the room was followed by a round of applause that took him by surprise. A young man with a shaved head approached and said, "I almost gave up everything, but after listening to you, I'm going to keep going." Frank just nodded. He didn't need to say anything else. Back at the garage, the routine continued the same. Hot coffee in a metal cup, an old radio playing at a low volume, cars arriving with problems and leaving with solutions. But there was something different in Frank's eyes. A serene glow, like someone who had finally found the right place after walking so much in the dark. It wasn't about beating Greg or proving anything to anyone. It was about finding himself again. About understanding that the value of a life is not in what is lost, but in what you choose to rebuild. And he chose to start over with the tools he had: honesty, effort, and loyalty. Anyone can open a garage, but few transform bricks, grease, and sweat into trust, respect, and hope.